Welcome to our discussion of sexual development throughout life. So I'm going to spend most of my time talking about development from infancy through young adulthood, and then we'll talk a little bit about later adulthood as well. All right. Well, let's start with something that I sort of teased you with in an earlier chapter when I mentioned one aspect of Freud's psychosexual development. In this section, we're going to talk about all the stages of Freud's psychosexual development theory. So let's get started with the oral stage. Freud believed that between ages 0, so birth, and about age 1, the libido was entirely focused on the mouth, the tongue, and the lips. Okay, so there's a few things that I just said there that need to be explained. All right, so first off, just to remind you, everybody has a vague notion of who Sigmund Freud was, and maybe not as specific of a knowledge of him. He was actually a Viennese medical doctor. He is not a psychologist. He was the founder, one of the contributing founders to psychoanalysis, to the field of psychiatry, and within that, he founded the school of thought called psychoanalysis. He was, as a medical doctor, a really strong believer that we have biological impulses, and that one of the big functions of socialization and rearing is really to try and get control over our biological urges and allow us to behave in ways that society expects and values. So he described parts of our personality that are entirely unconscious. For those of you who have taken personality theory, you know that there are 3 components of the personality according to Freud. The one that we're looking at here is the completely unconscious part of our personality that is called the id. The id is made up of 2 contradictory components. There's thanatos, which is the part of our id that is driven by the death instinct. So we're not going to talk about thanatos in this class, but in case I've made you curious, thanatos is the part of our unconscious that makes us do harmful things that feel good. The whole goal of the id is to make sure that we experience pleasure all the time. We should never be uncomfortable. We should never be bored. We should never be hungry. We should always just be at this perfect level of pleasure all the time. And so thanatos would have us do things that are potentially harmful to ourselves or to others, as long as they feel good. Thanatos doesn't really care about like the long-term, problems that might come from engaging in these behaviors. So, for example, thanatos is the part of our personality that would tell us to bite our cuticles, right, or chew our nails well below their quick. We do it because at the time it feels good. It helps us to deal with stress or something like that. But in the long run, it's harmful, right? But thanatos doesn't really care about the future. Thanatos just cares about what feels good right now. Now, I gave the example of biting our cuticles because it's a good example of something that we do where we use our mouth, our tongue, our lips to do something, right? So, we're biting our cuticles. Libido is the sexual instinct, according to Freud. It's not just sexual, though. It's really about anything that you do to preserve life. So if thanatos is that death instinct where you might do things that are harmful, but they feel good, libido is the side where you do things that feel good and they are life affirming. They make it more likely that you'll live. So the focus of the libido during the oral stage is on the mouth, tongue, and the lips because those behaviors, those parts of our body help us to get nutrition and to live. Right. So if we suck on things, if we bite things during our first year of life, they help to ensure our survival. Except for the things that we shouldn't be eating, in which case thanatos says, I don't care as long as it feels good at the moment. So your id, which is made up of thanatos and libido, has these 2 components that are kind of battling with each other, basically with both of them having the overarching goal of you being experiencing pleasure. One of them thanatos being the sort of harmful side of that and not caring that it could be harmful to yourself or to others. And then libido being the life affirming, doing things because it's in our best interest in the long run kinds of things. So all of that life affirming energy is on our mouth, tongue, and lips during infancy. And actually, I'm trying to go along with this chart that I found on the internet and copied and pasted because it was nice and easy. But I really want to switch that word libido to pleasure principle or id, the focus of the id, because some of the things that infants do with their mouth, tongues, and lips are harmful. Like I said, they might eat something that they shouldn't. They might bite somebody else, and that causes harm to someone else. But they don't care because it felt good to them. And, the truth is a baby who's 12 months or younger doesn't really even know that the other person has any feeling. And so it's purely, a pleasure thing for the infant that they would bite someone else. The major development that tends to happen during this period, according to Freud, is getting weaned. In his era, it was off the breast, but his followers have extended it to weaning off of formula and even weaning off of a pacifier or the thumb, right? Any kind of thing that you normally would have used your mouth, tongue, and lips for pleasure, and we're trying to get you to stop doing that as you age, that would be an example of weaning you, right? So whatever thing that you had been sucking on. Now, one of the things he pointed out and that a lot of researchers agree with today is that there's this really strong impulse for infants to use their mouth, tongue, and lips to suck and to explore the world. There's a lot of nerve endings in the mouth. When a baby is born, that's their area of the body that has the most sensation. And so it's a really informative part of the body. And so for Freud to say that it was the source of all of our, id energy makes a lot of sense in actual reality. So this is one of those stages of Freudian theory that actually matches up really well with the biology and the psychology of what we know about infants. So the adult fixation example would be if a person has left some of their psychic energy, their id behind at this stage, they might reveal that through smoking or through overeating or a bunch of other behaviors that I'll get to in a little bit. All right, the anal stage. Oh, now we can see why people are not that fond of Freud. He just says stuff, doesn't he? Anal. Okay. So here we are with a child now. We're talking about toddlers who are between the ages of 1 and 3. And now it starts to sound super creepy, doesn't it? The focus of the libido is the anus. That sounds creepy. But what he was talking about here is that the child starts to recognize sensations coming from a full bladder or from a full colon, right? And so they start to recognize the signals that cue that they need to, eliminate. And this is the prime time when they tend to get toilet trained, right? Between 1 and 3 is when most parents realize that their kids are recognizing what's going on and that they can start to, teach them that they don't have to use their diaper. They can instead go in the toilet. So toilet training is a major development, and it's a stressful development according to Freud. Just like weaning is stressful for children and having to go off the breast or bottle or give up their pacifier or their thumb, that this is a big change for children and that this can be really stressful. He said the same thing about toilet training, that, when they're in diapers, a lot of times they're kind of unaware of what's coming out of them or that it's going away or any of those kinds of things. And that during the toilet training process, really what's going on is the child is learning that things that come out of them are not desirable, that there are things that you don't want to keep around you after they've come out of you, and that they are really gaining a sense of personal control. And this is like a very basic thing that a child can start to develop their own sense that they are an active player in their own environment. So Freud thought that this was a really big transition for children to go from somebody who uses diapers to somebody who can on their own, decide to release. And this says anus, but it really he talked about bowel or bladder. Now, if a person has difficulty going through this period, they may display behaviors that are evidence of that. They may be really super orderly, or they might be super messy, things like that. So we'll come back to these fixations later. All right. We already talked in this class about the phallic stage, but I'll reiterate that, between the ages of 3 and 6, Freud thought that the biggest task was figuring out what it meant to be a person who has those genitals, right? And he really believed that when a little boy looks down and sees that he has a penis, he realizes that he's one of the chosen ones. And that when a girl looks down and recognizes that she doesn't have a penis, she doesn't, according to Freud, look down and think, oh, I have a vagina. Instead, she looks down and says, where's my penis? And knows that she must have done something really awful to cause someone to have castrated her. So for Freud, the first thing that happens to little girls is that they recognize that they are missing their penis, and that they are sort of facing the world from a posture of like guilt or shame that makes them more prone to anxiety or depression or other things that will emerge later in adulthood. So he thought that this was a really big, major, factor that goes on in our development, is recognizing whether we have a penis or not. And that's literally how he phrased it. So during this stage, recognizing which kind of genitals you have, and then ultimately going through the Oedipus complex that we talked about before, where the little boy falls in love with the mother, wants to murder the father so that the little boy can have unfettered access to the mom. Or theoretically with the girl, Freud had difficulty wrapping this one up, but theoretically with a little girl, she's going to fall in love with her dad and want to murder her mother so that she can have unfettered access to dad. The major development is how the child resolves that complex, the Oedipus or the Electra complex. He said for boys that fear that somebody would find out, especially dad would find out about his murderous thoughts, would cause retaliation in the form of castration. So that castration anxiety causes a little boy to repress all of his aggression that he'd been feeling towards dad and all of his lust that he'd been feeling towards his mom. And instead, he puts all of his energy into identifying with dad, so that hopefully someday when he gets older, he'll have the characteristics that would attract someone like mom, so that he can have his vicarious mom through his wife. Freud had a little difficulty with the wrapping up of the Electra complex. And I told you guys this before, but I'll just repeat it, that with the Electra complex, given that Freud believes that little girls think that the reason why they don't have a penis is because somebody castrated them, makes it really difficult to argue why would they ever repress their animosity towards their moms and their lust for their dads, because they don't suffer, little girls don't suffer from castration anxiety. So what would ever cause them to identify with their moms and repress their lust and their aggression that they had been experiencing? So Freud had a little difficulty wrapping up the Electra complex. Some of his followers argued that maybe little girls grow up to be women who rely too much on their dads because they have never really repressed the lust that they felt for their dads, and that maybe for the rest of their lives there's a little competitiveness between them and their moms because they've really never repressed the aggression that they felt towards their moms. But Freud did not argue that, and he didn't really necessarily agree with his followers who were making those arguments. So I'm not really sure what to do with the Electra complex personally, because it does, he wanted it to be symmetrical. He wanted it to be the same resolution as males would have gone through. We talked about this a little bit before, that Freud believed that the resolution of this, phallic stage really determines what kind of sexual orientation a person would have, what kind of gender identity a person would have. So he thought this was a very major stage in psychological development. The next stage he thought was much less important. He called this the latent stage. Latent usually means that nothing major is going on, that you're sort of experiencing a period of homeostasis. So between the ages of 6 and basically puberty, so this chart rounded that to 12, he thought that there was no body part where the libido or the psychic energy was attached. But he did think that what was going on during this stage is that you would develop lots of different kinds of defense mechanisms for protecting your ego. So you learn basically how to make excuses for yourself. But the goal is, the purpose of defense mechanisms is to keep your conscious part of your personality, we call it your ego, from knowing about your id impulses, so that you don't have to be aware that you have these undesirable impulses. So some of the undesirable impulses that you've already experienced up till this point, Freud thought, there are names for the defense mechanisms that would develop in response to these threats. And so, for example, when little boys realize that their dads might get really mad and castrate them if the dad found out that the little boy wanted to murder him, the response that the little boy displays, where he tries to identify with dad so he can be like him, that's actually a defense mechanism. Identification is considered a defense mechanism. So trying to be like someone who you admire, even if you don't innately feel like that, even if it's not your natural behaviors, but trying to behave like them, is an example of identification. Sometimes you'll see overcompensation, where a person has a particular instinct to behave in a certain way. So maybe a person wants to be aggressive. They may overcompensate for that natural instinct by acting really super nice, right? Being overly friendly and affectionate, something like that. There's a list of 29 different defense mechanisms that Freud generated to describe how we protect our egos from our true selves, our unconscious impulses. So that's what he says we're working on during this age group, is the development of these different kinds of ways of protecting our ego from our real selves. In the genital stage, which he says is from puberty on, our focus of our libido goes back to the genitals, but now instead of being about figuring out what kind of genitals we have, it's more focused on actually using our genitals for sexual pleasure. And so this is the major development, is when we start to display full sexual maturity, being attracted to a mate, engaging in sexual behavior, all of those things. So he has us at puberty, starting to be interested in sexual activities and things like that, that a lot of times, you can see why people didn't really care for Freud historically, because he has, from the very beginning, infants behaving in ways that are based on pleasure that sound a lot to adults like, sexual pleasure. He has them at 12 being interested in mature sexual stuff. And so a lot of people throughout history have really looked at him as like oversexed. Everything for him is about sex. I would like to point out it's not just sex, it's also aggression. It's all the stuff we're super happy to have as part of our characters. But he definitely saw infants as having sexual impulses. And really, but he considered them immature all the way up until puberty. He thought that these sexual impulses were immature impulses, sort of comparable to puppies who hump a pillow, right? He thought it was just immature practice. It was just exploring other parts of their personality. It didn't really mean anything deviant or bad. It just is what it is. It's just biology. And then from puberty on, we have this maturation where the person is actually wanting to start to explore their adult sexual impulses. So I wanted to spend a little bit of time talking about fixations, because so Freud thought that if the impulses of a particular stage were not appropriately indulged, either you were allowed to persist in those behaviors way beyond the age bracket that he's decided would be the appropriate time to be engaging in those behaviors, or you're deprived of it shy of when you should have been allowed to persist in that behavior. You will leave behind some of your id instincts. Some of your libido and thanatos will be left behind in those stages, and then you will display what he called fixation. So for example, if you have a baby who's less than a year old and has been weaned, is now, being forced to only drink out of a bottle and isn't allowed to suck their thumb or do any of their natural sucking things that they would do, biting things, using their mouth and tongue. If they're deprived of being able to do that, we have the adult fixation examples of smoking and overeating, but we also have sort of personality characteristics that we might expect to see in a person who was either too rigidly weaned, so they were much too young, or On the flip side, he said you get the same kinds of behaviors if they were indulged too much. So you have, a 3 or 4-year-old still using a pacifier or something like that. So you have these, either side for him would result in the adult fixations. And he thought they were the same either way. So if you were over or underindulged in your need to use your mouth to suck, bite, and whatever, he said that you could, as an adult, end up displaying a very characteristic personality component, which is dependence, lack of independence. So he said, because this is a stage when we are all completely dependent on our caregiver, that if we get fixated during this stage, we will display in our personality a tendency to let other people make decisions for us, other people rule us, things like that. So, oral stage, it doesn't matter whether it was over or underindulged. With the anal stage, it does matter whether it was over or underindulged. You get different outcomes. So if a child is too rigidly potty trained, so, closer to the 1-year phase, back when he was doing his theorizing, it was really common in Germany to have infants potty trained by 3 months of age. Yes, you heard me right. I said 3 months. They told parents that moms, let's be honest, they told moms the thing to do would be to watch your child's typical elimination patterns. And when you knew it was getting time for them to eliminate, hold them over a bedpan and not let them soil their diaper instead. And that's training the baby. I'm very skeptical. I'm thinking only mom's getting trained in that, but okay. They were very rigid. And just as an aside, this has nothing to do with Freud. They found that 10% of 18-year-old recruits in the German army in World War II were wetting their beds when they came to the army. One of the things about overly rigid potty training is that you may actually have an outcome where you've got a person who actually isn't as under as good a control as you would expect. So that's what we would consider really rigid, is if, you're well below, you're pushing right around the 1-year age. And that has characteristic outcomes. Over on our adult fixation example, orderliness is one of the characteristic outcomes. When I was a college student, we called people who were really neat and always wanted things to be done in a certain order and always were on time and all that stuff. We called them anal retentive. And for short, we just called them anal, right? Like, oh, that person's just really anal. I've heard college students these days call that OCD, which is actually a disorder, whereas calling somebody anal is just a personality trait, just implies that their parents potty train them too rigidly. I always like to joke. My mom had my brother and I potty trained right around a year and was very proud of it and very disappointed that I was not potty training my kids as early as she potty trained us. But I always like to joke that it's clear that I was, because, I have very much of a routine. I definitely like things to be, orderly. I definitely think I'm anal retentive. And that's what Freud says that you get from being potty trained early, is a person who maybe can even be too rigid, right? Like if things don't go the way that they expect, it can be very distressing for a person who's really anal retentive. Now, on the flip side, if you have a child who isn't potty trained by 3 years of age, which is the time that Freud said it needs to be done, I don't know that he's necessarily correct, but anyway, he says if they're over 3 years of age and still in diapers, they may display the messiness side, what he called anal expulsive. So if you were potty trained too rigidly, he called it anal retentive. And if you were potty trained in too relaxed of a fashion, he called that anal expulsive, which I just think is really a vivid name for what he's saying, right? He says that, the primary characteristic is messiness. They have difficulty following a schedule. They have difficulty taking personal responsibility. They just basically don't show as much personal control as a person who is potty trained at the ideal time would. And then on the other end of the spectrum would be the anal retentive person who shows too much personal control. And they might even take responsibility for things that aren't even their responsibility when you're too rigidly potty trained. And so if you have an anal retentive person, they have all these characteristics that just illustrate that they were potty trained too rigidly. Anal expulsive shows that they were probably too lax. During the phallic stage, we already talked about this in a previous lecture, but the thing I wanted to focus on here is his concept of penis envy. Something that's really unique to Freud is that he believed that if your libido urges, your id impulses were not adequately met during the phallic stage, whether you are male or female, you will respond to that the same way. So both males and females will display like masculine behaviors. So for a male, it would be like hypermasculine behaviors. For a female, he would say it would just be, a person behaving in a masculine way. So for a female who's displaying fixation, he would say that she's displaying penis envy through having a job or, expecting people to take her opinion into consideration, those crazy things. That was me being sarcastic because obviously women should have jobs and have, if they want, and they should have their opinion heard if they have one. And right? I mean, this is just like classic Freudian to be so sexist, right? Like it's normal for males to have jobs and want their opinions heard. Where males get hyper masculine is where they're trying to prove all the time how masculine they are. And it could, he said, be displayed through, having lots of sexual conquests or getting into lots of physical fights. Or he said, driving a really big vehicle would be an example of trying to show the rest of the world how powerful you are. So for females, it would be just behaving in a masculine way, what he characterized as a masculine way. And for males, it would be this hyper masculinity where there's these negative behaviors that they engage in. I just wanted to say that Freud came up with his idea of penis envy during the last few years of his life when he was suffering from throat cancer. And because apparently sometimes a cigar is just a cancer stick. And so he got cancer from all those cigars he consumed. And so his daughter by that time had become a psychiatrist also, and a Freud. And so he would be invited to give talks, and he couldn't give talks anymore because he had an opening between the back of his throat and his nose that was causing him to not be able to speak clearly and project and stuff. So he, people would ask him to come talk. He would show up, but then his daughter would actually give the speech, right? And during this period of his life is when he came up with the idea of penis envy, almost as if he was trying to characterize why his daughter was willing to do these things that it wasn't her theory she was lecturing on, that kind of thing. And it seems like his generation of this penis envy term might have been a reaction to his feelings of helplessness and inadequacy rather than an expression of her behavior. But anyway, he was the theorist and got to write down whatever he wanted. Okay, now in the latent phase, Freud said there was really nothing that could be over or underindulged, so he really dismissed this stage as something that you could be fixated at. So you'll see over on the right, it says there are no adult fixations. Some of his followers have offered a really interesting interpretation of what happens at the latent phase, though, because what they say is, while it's true that the unconscious id impulses aren't attached to any particular body part, they are directed outward. So during the 6 to 12 year period, there's a lot of emphasis on doing well in school and making lots of platonic friends and things like that. And so some of his followers have suggested that maybe people who are workaholics or people who have a lot of platonic friends and no mate type of friends, people who they are sexually attracted to, things like that, might be displaying evidence of being fixated at the latent stage. So I don't know if Freud would have agreed with that, but some of his followers have made that interpretation. The final stage you don't really get fixated at. The goal is, the hope is that as you've gone through the previous 4 stages, when you arrive at the genital stage, you'll have all of your psychic energy with you so that you can handle all the demands of adulthood in a really, competent, confident way. But the truth is, most of us have at least, one fixation, one piece of behavior or aspect of our personality that reveals that, maybe we didn't have our needs completely met at the earlier stage, or maybe they were overindulged, and so we left some of our energy behind. And what Freud thought that meant is that it's going to weaken our ability to cope with the varying demands of being an adult. So that's the basic theory, and you'll notice why I put this in here, because you can see how much impact his theory has on this idea of like these sexual impulses being at the heart of what's going on in all these stages, regardless of age, right? And then by the time we get to adulthood, he has sort of these stereotypes of what a healthy adult's behavior would look like, and then he tries to attribute any shortcomings or faults in his interpretation of how you're acting back to how your parents parented you. And just to make sure it's really clear, when I say parents, I mean, let's be honest, he blamed mom. It was always mom's fault. It was always mom's fault. So he got to decide what was healthy behavior. He got to decide the timings of these different stages. He tried to make it seem as though his timings were tied to biology, but we all know that people's biologies are not perfectly aligned. And so clearly he was imposing some judgments or some values onto these things that were not purely due to just objective numbers. So I just thought I'd throw in a little Freud psychosexual development. Let's move on to the next topic and sort of cleanse our palate from him. We'll come back and talk about evidence that we have for sexual impulses in infancy and childhood.